What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing. The Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series will continue its conversation with you concerning the complete history of boxing. I'm going to individualize fighters who were major players during their era. That's important because in order for you to understand the era of men you are researching, you must understand the major players. What were their expectations, and did they succeed in their expectations? What propositions were they given? How did they deal with those propositions? Were they given opportunities? A shot at titles? If not, and or if so, how did they deal with it? The fighter in the image that is on your screen is a prime example of what opportunity is. This fighter's name is Theodore Tiger Flowers. He be known to the boxing community as the Georgia Deacon. The Georgia Deacon was the first black world middleweight champion in boxing history. He was a milestone. He was born August 5th, 1895. He would die November 16th, 1927. Between May 2nd, 1921 and December 15th, 1921, Theodore Tiger Flowers would step into the ring 14 times, losing twice to Panama Joe Gans. Between January 1st, 1922 and December 22nd, 1927, he would step into the ring 21 times. He would take on Kid Norford twice, Eddie Palmer twice, Kid Davis twice. He would even entertain a match with the Jamaica Kid. He would take on Lee Anderson, who was known as the Harlem Bully. He'd be stopped in 2 rounds by Sam Langford. Theodore Tiger Flowers would face them all. He was a milestone. Between February 21st, 1923 and December 28th of 1923, he would walk into the ring 16 times, facing fighters such as Jamaica Kid, Fireman Jim Flynn, Tut Jackson, just to name a few. Between January 23rd, 1924 and December 26th of 1924, once again he would walk into the ring an average of 16 times. June 8th, 1925, Lee Anderson, the future colored world light heavyweight champion, would face Theodore Tiger Flowers in Shibe Park, Philadelphia. A 10-round unanimous decision. Now, June 8th, Theodore Tiger Flowers would take on Lee Anderson, and that was some contest. As I explained to you, Theodore Tiger Flowers and Lee Anderson will fight the first colored light heavyweight championship contest. And once again, that makes Theodore Tiger Flowers, in my opinion, a milestone. He set the trend. He took chances. He was a middleweight. He would move up to the light heavyweight division to find or seek more opportunity. Between February 26, 1926 and December 3rd, 1926, he would win the World Middleweight Championship crown from the Pittsburgh Windmill, Harry Greb. On February 26 of 1926, he would take on Maxie Rosenblum, Lee Anderson, and he would lose the crown to Mickey Walker on December 3rd, 1926. Let's talk about that Mickey Walker bout for one moment. Mickey Walker had a manager who dealt business with the mob. Al Capone and Jack Kearns did business quite often. This contest took place in Chicago at the Chicago Coliseum. And Theodore Tiger Flowers wouldn't have had an opportunity in that fight to have his hand raised. Not when Al Capone had his fingerprints all over that bout. All Mickey Walker had to do was remain on his feet. As he was dropped in that bout, but he would get back up. And Theodore Tiger Flowers would unfortunately see his title loom past his very eyes. Between January 6, 1927 and November 12th of 1927, he would have 19 bouts facing Maxie Rosenblum, Pete Latzo. Now, Pete Latzo was a welterweight. Pete Latzo would become a champion. He would take on Mickey Walker and Tommy Loughran, who was known as the Philly Phantom. He was a very good fighter, Pete Latzo was. And so was Maxie Rosenblum, who would become a light heavyweight champion. Maxie Rosenblum had well over 300 bouts. They called him Slappy Maxie because he didn't have punching power. But if you look at the Hall of Famers he was in the ring with, it's mind-blowing. Flowers would also be in the ring with Chuck Wiggins and Tut Jackson, Allentown Joe Gans. What a story of the great Theodore Tiger Flowers. Man with conviction, man with the ability to endure the circumstances that surrounded him. What do I mean? When he faced the Pittsburgh Windmill, Harry Greb faced him in New York's Madison Square Garden. I mentioned to you, because of that bout, Theodore Tiger Flowers would become the first black middleweight champion to fight in New York's Madison Square Garden. That happened on February 26 of 1926. What would also happen was Red Sunday. What that means, when a black fighter defeated a white fighter, there were consequences, as it was on July 4th of 1910, Reno, Nevada, with the first black heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson, and the Boilermaker, Jim Jeffries. After that contest, major cities such as Detroit, Chicago, and New York was in chaos. Little boys were beaten. They had gasoline poured down their throats. Homes were burnt and lit on fire. Cars were overturned. Men were hung. Chaos is an understatement. But when you look at what history brings, sometimes you have to lay down in order for others to stand up. Jack Johnson took that fall for Joe Louis. Joe Louis took that fall for Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali took that fall for Iron Mike Tyson. Iron Mike Tyson took that fall for Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder. When you look at the history of boxing, when you understand what's important, you have a better understanding of what the game actually means. The game is life. What happens in the ring happens outside the ring. Who you are in the ring can be transformed to your very existence. Theodore Tiger Flowers, to me, not only a great fighter, but he was a great milestone. Shout out to Theodore Tiger Flowers. I want to take a look at Ray Robinson for one moment. I want to deep dive his career, deep dive his lifestyle. As we do that, we're going to go from the beginning to the very end of his career. This may take a second video to complete this conversation, but so be it. So Ray Robinson, he was known as the Harlem Nightstick, the Harlem Jitterbug. As Smitty, he was known as the Tap Dance Kid. Many may not know that. But who was this Tap Dance Kid? Mickey Walker and others did admire him. His name was Walker Smith. He was born May 3rd, 1921 in Alley, Georgia. He would die April 12th, 1989 in Harlem, New York. He was stopped through Detroit, Michigan, as his mother would seek a better life. From Detroit, Michigan, he would take a trip up to New York, Harlem to be exact. But while in Detroit, Walker Smith would meet a future heavyweight champion. His name was Joseph Louis Barrow. How did they meet? Walker Smith, like many other inner city kids, would find ways to entertain himself. By that I mean through sports, outside in the street. Because during those days, you had to stay in front of the window where your parents could see you. And one of the games that the young men would play during that time was either stickball or stoopball. Stickball would be used as a force of entertainment. It was somewhat called the poor man baseball, if you will. Stoopball, you would take a Spalding ball or a sponge ball, bang it up against the side of a curb. You would still have your first, third, and second base. First base may be a fire hydrant. Second base might be a car, Mr. Jackson's car, as an example. And the third base might be the lamppost. Now, during those days, you had to be home before the lights went out. That lamppost would assure that. And home plate would be the very object that you would use to bounce the ball off of an object as if it was a baseball bat, and that would be the stoop. Well, engaging in this game, Smitty, as they called him in his community, Walker Smith, for the sake of this conversation, would go chasing after a ball after it has been hit. He would roll down the street. It would be a young man who would step on the ball, preventing it from going down a sewer. Walker Smith would look up, and he would notice Joseph Louis Barrow. At this time, Joseph Louis Barrow had somewhat of a name for himself, and he was well respected in his community. Walker Smith would look up, and his eyes gazed, because he couldn't believe that he was in the very existence of a man he much admired. You see, how Joseph Louis Barrow would become Joseph Louis Barrow. His mother would give him 50 cents for violin lessons that he did not care for. However, during those days, you accepted what you were given without any grievances, if you will. So Joseph Louis Barrow would one day walk down the street en route to his violin lessons with his violin case in hand. He had a friend by the name of Thurston McKinley. Both these men were in a school for young men who did not quite keep up on an educational level with other kids. His name was Thurston McKinley, and he began to ruffle the feathers, if you will, of Joseph Louis Barrow, because Joseph Louis Barrow was a tall fellow, as was Thurston McKinley. Thurston McKinley was a Golden Gloves champion in Detroit. He understood how to use his hands to express himself, if you will. So he would begin ruffling the feathers of Joseph Louis Barrow, stating to him, a man of your size should not be holding a stick with a string attached, making sounds. He said that was for sissies. That Thurston McKinley was something else, man. But he would soon entice Joseph Louis Barrow to find out a little bit more about what he should be doing other than what he was currently doing. So Thurston McKinley would reach out of his back pocket. He would take a newspaper that was folded in 4 pieces, and we'd open up the center page, and he would express what Joseph Louis Barrow's new career would eventually be. Kid Chocolate would earn $75,000 in facing Al Singer. And this was a big deal in the African American community. This took place in 1928. And that was enough to convince Joseph Louis Barrow to walk into the gymnasium that was a half a block away from that conversation. The gymnasium was called the Brewster Center. Now, after Joseph Louis Barrow would step into the gymnasium, he would experience what he would experience. He began to take that more seriously. Going back on the night that Smitty would meet Joseph Louis Barrow, Joseph Louis Barrow had a problem. He was keeping a secret from his mother. The secret of becoming a prize fighter. In order to go to the gym with the equipment that he needed to entertain himself, Joseph Louis Barrow had to walk across the street, but he had to time it perfectly because he could not allow his mother's friend, their neighbor, to spot him. You see, that neighbor worked in a laundromat that was across the street from Brewster Center. And she would surely tell his mother what she had seen. So he had Thurston McKinley carrying his bags for a short time, and McKinley said, "I'm not carrying this anymore. You're a big boy, you handle this yourself." But Joseph Louis Barrow was what was called a mama's boy, did not dare disrespect or disappoint her. So in order to keep that secret a secret, he had to find another way to handle that problem. And that's when he ran into Smitty. And he saw that Smitty was so fond of him, he gave Smitty a proposition. He asked Smitty if he wouldn't mind carrying his bag for him to the gymnasium. In exchange, he would give him a piece of candy. You see, during those days, milk and bread used to be a penny a piece. Then it would go up to 3 cents. So times were hard. The following year of 1928, 1929 would be the Depression because the stock market would crash on Wall Street in New York. But it affected all the major cities. We talked about Benny Leonard. Benny Leonard would retire in 1925. He was a world lightweight champion, a Jewish fella. But he would lose $500,000 in that same stock market. So it affected every young man in the communities in which they lived. So that was a great deal for Smitty. And he was honored to carry the bags to the gymnasium for Joseph Louis Barrow. And that's how those two men would meet. And they would run into each other once again in Harlem, New York. Now, Walker Smith stood 6 foot. He weighed 118 to 165 pounds. He was managed by George Gangsford and also managed by Kurt Horman. He was trained by Harry Wiley Sr. Now, Harry Wiley Sr. worked as a water boy for Kid Blackie, Manasseh Moeller. You know him as Jack Dempsey. Jack Dempsey would become the world heavyweight champion between July 4th, 1919, Toledo, Ohio. He was stopped, the world heavyweight champion, a giant man by the name of Jess Willard. Now, he would lose his title to the Fighting Marine Gene Tunney, September 23rd, 1926. And then the famous long count, September 27th, 1927. It seems like September 22nd was a very famous date. And as we move on with this series, we'll understand why. Now, Harry Wiley Sr. wrapped the hands of the great Iron Man from West Hoboken, Joe Jeanette, the Brown Panther, Harry Wills, and the Boston Bone Crusher, Sam Langford. Now, Smitty would eventually have an amateur record of 85 total bouts, 69 knockouts with 40 knockouts in the very first round. It was a bantamweight between 1935 and 1938. He would win the AAU Metropolitan Finals from a fighter named Eddie Capelli. As a featherweight, he fought between 1938 and 1939. He would pick up the Golden Gloves, winning the finals from Louis Spider Valentine. Now, Louis Spider Valentine was somewhat of a stablemate. We'll talk about him in a moment. As a lightweight, he fought between 1940 and 1941. He would pick up the Golden Gloves, defeating Andy Nanelli. Now, this was a big deal because Andy Nanelli had a big name during those years. He would defeat him, and he would become a two-time inner city, two-time New York Golden Glove champion. He would also win the Chicago Golden Gloves. He would spar many rounds with the Cincinnati Cobra, Charlie Burley. Ezzard Charles. He would fight Ezzard Charles in sparring. And Ezzard Charles would wind up becoming a middleweight, great one at that. He would move up to light heavyweight, but he would become the fourth. And this is important. He was actually the third black heavyweight champion in boxing history. You had Jack Johnson, 1908. You had Joe Louis, 1937. Now you had Ezzard Charles in 1949. We'll talk about 1940 in one moment because that was a very special year. As a matter of fact, let's stay on 1940. The greatest prospects in boxing history, in my opinion, turned professional from the amateur ranks in 1940. Who were those prospects? Ezzard Charles, the Cincinnati Cobra. Willie Pep, they called him the Will of the Wisps. Jimmy Bivens. Ezzard Charles. He was known as Max. As I said, he was the Cincinnati Cobra. Ray Robinson. But you would also have Cleo Shane, Jake LaMotta, who actually earned his license in 1940, but he wouldn't have his first fight until 1941. I consider him a 1940s fighter. Bo Jack, who would have a fight or two in 1939, but he would really get started in 1940. I consider him a 1940s fighter. And before we go further, I'm going to let you know one little secret. The reason why I have 1940 as one of the most upsetting years in boxing history, those men that I named, Willie Pep, will lose his title 1950-1951 against Joe Sandy Settler. Ezzard Charles will lose his title when he would win it in 1949, but he would lose it in 1951 against Jersey Joe Walcott. You also had Ike Williams. He turned professional in 1940. He would defeat Juan Zurita in Mexico City and knocking him out in 2 rounds. But how he was rewarded, he had every single liquid thrown at him. Every stain you can think of landed on Ike Williams. He had to run out of the ring and run to his locker room where he was there presented with his new lightweight championship belt. Now, he would win the NBA version of the lightweight championship title. He was then met in that locker room with Sidney Walker, Bo Jack. Those two men would get it on in 1948, and we'll talk about that as we get to that point. My point is, these fighters turned professional, and they would lose their titles in 1951. Ray Robinson would defeat Jake LaMotta February 14th, 1951. It was known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. We'll talk about that. In 1951. But then he would lose his title the same year to Randy Turpin in 1951. Now, he would be the only fighter to regain that title out of the men that we talked about. Jake LaMotta would defeat Marcel Cerdan, 1949. He would become the middleweight champion of the world, and he would lose his title in 1951. So 1951 was one of the most upsetting years in all of boxing. So 1940 was a phenomenal year because it produced those very same fighters in the professional ranks. Ray Robinson turned professional. He would end his career with a record of 202 total bouts, 109 knockouts, 6 draws, 19 losses. And he'd be stopped one time. Let's clear that up. What stopped Ray Robinson in New York's Yankee Stadium in 1952 against Joey Maxim, who was a light heavyweight champion, was not the fighter, it was the heat. You see, it was over 108 degrees. It was flies everywhere. It was a muggy night. It was a heat wave. And a younger man fighting his style, a lighter fighter with combinations consistently, is going to overexert himself in an environment such as that. And that's what happened. So I just wanted to make that clear. Now, I mentioned as a welterweight he fought between 1942 and 1950. If I did not, I am now. He would take on fighters such as Sammy Engat, Maxie Shapiro, Marty Servo, Fritzie Zivit, Maxie Berger, Henry Armstrong, Jackie Wilson, and Ralph Zanelli, Izzy Gennaro, as well as Kid Gavilan. That's a mouthful. Randy Turpin would be a fighter that he would fight as a middleweight. He fought in that division from 1951 to 1965. Along with Turpin would be Gene Foreman, Carmen Basilio, Rocky Graziano, and Carl Bobo Olsen, Paul Pender, Denny Moyer, Terry Downs, and Joey Giardello. But he would win that title on the night of February 14th, 1951 in Chicago Stadium against Jake LaMotta. Now I'm going to teach you something that you may or may not have known. Ray Robinson would spar with the likes of Billy Graham, Willie Pep, and Sandy Sadler in the lighter divisions. He would spar with heavyweights such as Danny Cox, Turkey Thompson, Harry Bobo, Spank Johnson, Big Boy Brown, Eddie Blunt, Joseph Louis Barrow, and George Fitch, as well as Wallace Cross from Orange, New Jersey, Perk Daniels of Chicago, J.D. Turner from Dallas, Texas. Middleweights he would spar with men like Joe Blackwood of Philadelphia, Holman Williams of Detroit, and then Harlem, New York, Ezra Charles from Cincinnati, Ohio, Charlie Green from California, Alan Faulkner of Buffalo, New York, Freddie Flores, Larry Fontaine, Ozzie Bulldog Harris. He'd be in the ring with Shorty Hughes and Kid Tenero of Cuba. These were the men that he sparred with as a middleweight. As a welterweight, he sparred with fighters such as Herbert Lewis Hardwood, you know him as Coco Kid, Charlie Green, and Johnny Green, Tony Pallone, the New York racketeer. He walked with a limp, but he was a very good fighter. Willis Johnson, Melvin Johnson. So as a lightweight, Ray Robinson would spar with fighters such as Bobby Henderson out of New York, Freddie Herman, and Willie Jackson. Willie Jackson would have a very good career. We'll talk about him at a later date. Now, Ray Robinson would become Ray Robinson in 1938 when he wanted to enter the Metropolitan AAU competition He would eventually become a champion as a bantamweight in 1938. His first challenge would be conquered. But he would win the World Welterweight Championship title at the age of 26 at the legendary New York's Madison Square Garden against a Youngstown, Ohio welterweight, ranked number 7. His name was Tommy Bell. Tommy Bell at that point in time had a record of 39 wins, 10 losses, and 3 draws. Now, Ray Robinson had faced Tommy Bell earlier that year, and he would defeat Tommy Bell. Now, let me tell you what's interesting about Ray Robinson. He would face Frizzy Zivit. He would take on Jake LaMotta. He would take on Kid Gamelon. He faced Tommy Bell. Who was Tommy Bell? He was born in December 20. No, he would fight December 20th, 1946 in New York's Madison Square Garden against Ray Robinson. He was 23 years old. He stood 5 foot 7 inches. He was a welterweight. He was the son of Shed and Bessie, and he had a brother named Howard and Bobby Bell. On the night of December 20th, 1946, New York's Madison Square Garden, he would pack the crowd, along with, obviously, the great Ray Robinson, against some much anticipating Harlemites. 15,670 to be exact. They were hardworking fight fans. They invested $82,948 to watch Smitty, better known as Ray Robinson. Now, Tommy Bell only got that opportunity. He was ranked number 7. But when Tippy Larkin, who would eventually become the junior welterweight champion, and Bojack, who would become a 2-time New York SAC lightweight champion. Interesting enough, Bojack and Tippy Larkin would fight one another for the vacant lightweight championship crown, with Tippy Larkin being stopped in 3 rounds. Tippy Larkin would fight New York's Madison Square Garden 19 times. Bojack would fight New York's Madison Square Garden as a main event fighter 21 times. Now, Marty Servo would drop his title because he was the welterweight champion at that time. He was also the cousin of the lightweight champion, Lou Ambers, the Hickmaya Hurricane. And he would drop his title after facing Rocky Graziano. Graziano would break his nose. Ray Robinson would face Marty Servo a couple of times. And Marty Servo knew he couldn't defeat Ray Robinson because of his style. And he decided to retire. So he dropped the belt. And that's what made the belt vacant. Let's listen out for part 2 of Ray Robinson, the museum.